The most famous lawman in the American West was shot in the back of the head on a quiet road in New Mexico. A man confessed before lunch. A jury let him walk. And for more than 100 years, almost nobody has believed he did it alone. His name was Pat Garrett. You know him, even if you think you don't. He was the sheriff who killed Billy the Kid. He pulled the trigger that ended one of the most famous outlaws in American history. He wrote the book that built the legend. He controlled the ending of another man's story. And then someone took that same right away from him. On February 29, 1908, Pat Garrett was riding in a buggy on a lonely road outside Las Cruces. He stepped down. He took off one glove, and he was dead before he hit the ground. The man who confessed was a young cowboy arguing about goats. The lawyer who defended that cowboy would later become one of the most corrupt politicians in American history. And somewhere in the background of the whole case is the name of a hired gunman who specialized in killings that looked like something else. By the end of this video, you're going to have to pick, because the official story doesn't survive contact with the evidence. To understand why Pat Garrett's death is one of the great unsolved murders of the American West, you have to understand why his life made him a target in the first place. Garrett was tall, 6'4" in a century when most men were 5'6". He had the bearing of a man who expected other men to move aside, and most of them did. By 1880, he was the elected sheriff of Lincoln County, New Mexico, in a territory still bleeding from the Lincoln County War. That conflict had mixed business rivalry, political revenge, and cattle money into something close to open warfare. One of the men it left loose was a young killer named William Bonney. You know him as Billy the Kid. The Billy that later memory turned into a charming young rebel had already escaped jail, killed 2 deputies, and become a public challenge to whether the law in New Mexico still meant anything. Garrett hunted him. On July 14, 1881, in a dark room in Pete Maxwell's house at Fort Sumner, Billy walked in. Garrett fired. Billy died. That single shot made Pat Garrett famous for the rest of his life. A year later, a book appeared under his name, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, and it did something strange. It made the man Garrett had killed more famous than Garrett himself. The legend ate the lawman. Without Billy, Garrett would have been just another hard frontier officer. Because of Billy, Garrett became a name, a reputation, a man people had opinions about 20 years after the fact. But fame in the old Southwest was not the same as safety. It was a kind of paint. It made you visible. And by the time Pat Garrett was riding in that buggy on February 29, 1908, a lot of men had been looking at him for a long time. Here's something almost no one tells you about Pat Garrett's last years. He was broke. The man who killed Billy the Kid had political friends for a while. President Theodore Roosevelt appointed him collector of customs in El Paso. It was a real job with real salary. Then Roosevelt didn't reappoint him. By 1906, Garrett was back in New Mexico, owning ranch property east of Las Cruces, trying to sell, trying to hold things together, and running out of options. He had leased part of his land to a young cowboy named Wayne Brazel, and Brazel had filled it with goats. That sounds like a joke. It isn't. In cattle country in 1908, goats were not just animals. They were an insult. They ate grass down to the dirt. They ruined fences. They told every neighbor that the land had stopped being cattle land. For a man like Garrett trying to sell a ranch, goats on the property were a financial disaster and a personal humiliation at the same time. Garrett wanted the lease ended. Brazel refused. There were arguments. There were, according to later testimony, threats. So, on the surface, the official story makes sense. A lawman with a temper, a young cowboy with a stubborn streak, a dispute over land, a killing on a lonely road. Brazel confessed. A jury heard it. Case closed. Except the case was never that clean, because hovering over the entire story was something Garrett had been involved with 12 years earlier. Something that powerful men in southern New Mexico had never forgiven him for. In 1896, a lawyer named Albert Jennings Fountain disappeared. Fountain was not a small man in New Mexico. He had been a legislator. He had prosecuted cattle rustlers. He had made enemies of the most powerful ranching interests in the territory. And on a road near White Sands, he and his 8-year-old son Henry vanished. Their bodies were never found. Garrett was brought in to investigate. He pursued men connected to the powerful ranching circles of the region. He arrested 2 of them, Oliver Lee and Jim Gilliland. In 1899, both were acquitted. The case collapsed. But the men Garrett had gone after did not forget, and the lawyer who defended them, the man who walked them out of that courtroom free, was named Albert Bacon Fall. Remember that name, Albert Fall, because when Wayne Brazel shot Pat Garrett dead 9 years later, the lawyer who took Brazel's case, the man who turned that confession into an acquittal, was the same Albert Fall. And Albert Fall would, 15 years after that, become the first United States Cabinet Secretary in American history to be sent to federal prison. The scandal was called Teapot Dome. You may have heard of it. He took bribes. He sold federal oil reserves to the highest bidder. He was, by the standards of his own era, one of the most corrupt men in American public life. That is, the lawyer who got Pat Garrett's killer off. So when you hear that this was a simple quarrel over goats, you have to ask why a man of Fall's power was personally involved in defending a young cowboy on a self-defense charge. You have to ask what was being protected, and you have to ask who exactly benefited when Pat Garrett stopped being able to talk. So let's go to the road. February 29th, 1908, Leap Day. A buggy moves along the Mail Scott Road, a rough track running northeast out of Las Cruces through open desert. Inside the buggy are two men. Pat Garrett is one of them. The other is a man named Carl Adamson. Adamson had presented himself as part of a deal to buy Garrett's ranch. That morning he was driving Garrett into town to finalize the arrangement. Riding alongside on horseback was Wayne Brazel. This is the first thing that should bother you. Why is Brazel there? The least dispute is the supposed motive for what's about to happen. Why is the man Garrett is in conflict with riding next to the buggy on the way to a land sale that would resolve the conflict in Garrett's favor? Hold that question. The buggy stops. The accounts of why differ. Some say Garrett needed to relieve himself. Some say there was an argument. What is agreed is that Garrett stepped down from the buggy. He took off one glove, and then he was shot. He was shot twice. One bullet entered the back of his head. Another struck him in the body. He fell beside the road. Now here's the problem with the official story. If Garrett was reaching for a shotgun in the buggy, as Brazel later claimed, why was he turned away? If Brazel fired in fear for his life, in a face-to-face confrontation with a dangerous man, why was the killing wound in the back of Garrett's skull? If Carl Adamson saw the whole thing from a few feet away, why did his testimony become so quiet, so awkward, so easily managed by the time the case went to court? A man does not get shot in the back of the head in self-defense. A man gets shot in the back of the head because someone wanted him dead and chose the moment. Brazel and Adamson rode into Las Cruces. Brazel surrendered to Deputy Sheriff Felipe Lucero and announced that he had killed Pat Garrett. The coroner's jury named him as the shooter. On paper, everything moved exactly the way it was supposed to. Then Albert Fall took the case, and almost immediately the prosecution started to fall apart. Carl Adamson, the one man who supposedly saw everything, never became the firm public anchor a murder trial of a famous lawman should have. The prosecution's case was thin. The defense leaned hard on Garrett's reputation as a dangerous man, on the alleged threats, on the claim that Brazel had simply reacted in fear. The jury acquitted. The man who confessed walked out of the courthouse a free man, and almost no one at the time, and almost no historian since, has been willing to say that's the whole story. So if it wasn't just Brazel, or if it wasn't only Brazel, then who else was on that road, in spirit or in fact? There are 4 real suspects in the death of Pat Garrett. Let me rank them from the most innocent-looking to the most damning. Suspect number 4, Wayne Brazel himself, acting alone. This is the official story. A young cowboy, a real land dispute, a dangerous older man, a moment of fear, a self-defense shooting. Brazel confessed. The court accepted his account. Men have killed over less than land and pride. But here's what doesn't fit. Brazel's confession was almost too cooperative. He rode straight into town and turned himself in. He did not run, he did not hide, he did not panic. He behaved like a man who had been told what was going to happen next and trusted that it would. And the wounds don't match a self-defense story. You don't shoot a man in the back of the head because you fear him in the moment. You shoot him in the back of the head because you've decided he has to die. Suspect number 3, Carl Adamson. Adamson is the man almost no one talks about, which is exactly why he matters. He was the one who got Garrett onto that road. He was driving the buggy. He was the eyewitness whose testimony should have decided the case, and he was somehow not the immovable anchor a prosecution needed. Some researchers have suggested Adamson may have been part of the setup itself, that the ranch sale was the bait, and his job was to deliver Garrett to the spot where the killing would happen. If that's true, Brazel may have pulled the trigger, but Adamson opened the door. Suspect number 2, a hired gun named Jim Miller. His full name was James Brown Miller. He was known across the Southwest by a different name. They called him Killer Miller. He was one of the most prolific paid assassins of his era, a man whose speciality was killings that looked, at first glance, like something else. Some historians have argued that Miller was hired to kill Pat Garrett, and that Wayne Brazel was the convenient young man chosen to take credit for it. This theory has weight because the wounds look more like an ambush than a quarrel. It fits a world where powerful men did not pull their own triggers. They paid, they used distance, they used silence. And Jim Miller is exactly the kind of man powerful enemies would hire if they wanted Pat Garrett dead and wanted a story that would hold up just long enough. The case against the Miller theory is that no one has ever proven he was in New Mexico on February 29, 1908. The case for it is that everything about the killing, the cleanness, the placement of the wound, the speed of the legal cleanup, looks like his work. Suspect number 1, the men around the fountain case. This is the deepest answer and the hardest to prove. Pat Garrett had spent 12 years carrying the weight of an investigation that had never been resolved. Albert Fountain and his 8-year-old son had vanished, and the men Garrett had suspected had walked free. If Garrett still intended to expose what he believed had happened, or if anyone thought he might, then he wasn't just a debtor with a bad lease anymore. He was a threat to powerful men with land, money, and political reach. The lawyer who defended the men Garrett accused in the Fountain case was Albert Fall. The lawyer who defended the man who killed Garrett was Albert Fall. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And the pattern says that Pat Garrett died because he had spent his whole life walking too close to men who could afford to make a problem disappear. So what really happened on that road? The honest answer is that Wayne Brazel almost certainly pulled the trigger. But Wayne Brazel was not the only finger on the gun. The ranch sale was the bait, Carl Adamson was the delivery, Albert Fall was the insurance, and somewhere behind all of it were the men who had been waiting 12 years for Pat Garrett to stop being a problem they had to think about. This is the part of the American West that the movies don't show you. The real frontier was not won by single men facing each other in the open street. It was settled by paperwork, land deals, lawyers, and quiet arrangements between men with money. Pat Garrett knew that better than almost anyone alive. He had hunted Billy the Kid through a country of informants, friends, enemies, and half-truths. He understood exactly how the system worked. And on a lonely road outside Las Cruces, that same system finally turned around and used what it knew about him. The man who wrote the ending to Billy the Kid's life had his own ending written by other men. The buggy, the glove, the wound in the back of the head, the confession before lunch, the acquittal, the silence. None of it was an accident. All of it was managed. Pat Garrett did not die in a showdown. He died in a transaction. So I'm going to leave you with the question I had to ask myself when I went through this case. If it was just Wayne Brazel, a cowboy, a quarrel, a moment of panic, then the most famous lawman in the American West died for nothing. Goats and a lease. That's the small ending. If it was Jim Miller, hired by men whose names we still half recognize, then Garrett died because his enemies had finally run out of patience and bought a solution. If it was the long shadow of the Fountain case, if Garrett was killed because of what he knew or what someone thought he might still say, then he died for the same reason a lawyer and his 8-year-old son disappeared 12 years earlier. Because some men in southern New Mexico had decided certain questions were not allowed to be asked. You've heard the evidence. You've seen who benefited. You know who took the case. Who killed Pat Garrett? Tell me in the comments, because the jury in 1908 gave their answer in less than a day, and more than 100 years later, almost no one believes them. The man who killed Billy the Kid is buried in Las Cruces. The road where he died is still out there in the desert, and the question of who really pulled that trigger and who paid them to do it, is still waiting for someone honest enough to answer it.